Assalamualaikum and good day everyone. My name is Ahmad Mikael, metric number S75114, and today I will be presenting question 1, offer, counter-offer and acceptance under the Contract Act 1950. This case involved a dispute between the Speedster's motors, John and Jane, over the purchase of Speedster's XX5. The main issue is whether John's email agreeing to pay the advertised price of Rm5,000 ringgit created a valid acceptance and a legally binding contract, even though the car had already been sold to Jane. In this presentation, we will analyze the legal issue by applying a relevant provision of the Contract Act 1950 and the applicable case law. So, let us begin.
Hello, my name is Nurul Nabila binti Muhammad Nuzi and my metric number is 75071. Today I will be presenting my part of the case analysis, which focuses on the legal issues and legal principles involved in the dispute between Speedster Motors and the parties concerned. Moving on to the issues in this case, there are four main legal issues that need to be determined. First, we need to determine whether the advertisement published by Speedster Motors is a binding offer or merely an invitation to trade. This is important because it affects whether customer can immediately accept their advertisement and create a contract. Second, we need to examine whether John's telephone offer of 45,000 amounts to a counter offer. If is it considered a counter offer, it may terminate the original offer under contract law. Third, we need to determine whether John's subsequent email offering 50,000 constitute a valid acceptance of the original offer or whether it should be regarded as a new proposal. Finally, we need to decide whether a valid and legally binding contract was formed between Speedster Motors and Jane when the company accepted her offer of 55,000. To resolve these issues, we will now discuss the relevant legal principles and authorities. Next, I will explain the legal principles that are relevant to this case. Firstly, under Section 2A of the Contract Act 1950, a proposal is defined as an expression of willingness to do or abstain from doing something with the intention of obtaining the assent of another person. Generally, advertisements are regarded as invitation to trade rather than binding offers. This principle was established in Collier versus the Public Services Commission. Secondly, Section 7A of the Contract Act 1950 states that acceptance must be absolute and unqualified. Therefore, any attempts to alter the terms or price of an offer will amount to a counter-offer. Thirdly, according to the counter-offer rule established in High V French, a counter-offer effectively rejects and terminates the original offer. Once the original offer has been rejected, it cannot later be accepted unless it is renewed by the offerer. Lastly, Section 4.2 of the Contract Act 1950 emphasizes the importance of communicating acceptance in order to form a binding contract. Once negotiations have been interrupted by a counter-offer, any later attempts to proceed requires a fresh proposal and fresh acceptance, as illustrated in Longvivod versus Taylor. This legal principle will be applied to the facts of the case to determine whether a valid contract exists between the parties.
Next, I will explain the application of the law to the facts of this case. First, regarding John, Speedster's Motors advertised the Speedster's XX5 for 50,000 ringgit under Section 2A of the Contract Act 1950. This advertisement is only an invitation to trade, not a binding offer. This principle is supported by the case of Colho versus the Public Services Commission. John then offered to buy a car for 55,000 ringgit. This was a counter-offer, not acceptance. Under Section 7A, an acceptance must be absolute and unqualified. Since John changed the price, he rejected the original terms. This follows the principle established in Height versus Range. Later, John emailed and agreeing to pay the advertised price of 50,000 ringgit. However, this was not a valid acceptance because the previous negotiation had already ended. Following the Longwood versus Taylor, John's email was considered a new proposal since Speedster's motto never accepted this proposal under Section 4(2). No contract was formed between John and the company. Now, regarding to Jane. Jane made a separate offer of 55,000 ringgit and Mr. Tan accepted her offer immediately. Since there was a valid offer and a clear communication of acceptance, a legally binding contract was formed between Jane and Speedster's motors. In conclusion, John has no contractual rights because no contract was formed with him. On the other hand, Jane's offer are validly accepted, making her party with the legally enforceable contract.
Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera. My name is Nurul Hazwani binti Zabidi and my metric number is 7xx2. Next, I will explain the argument in this case. An advertisement is usually considered an invitation to trade rather than a binding offer. Therefore, the advertisement of the speed test SX5 did not create any actual obligation on speed test motor. Interested buyers still needed to submit their own offer and the company had the right to accept or reject those offers. The law also states that an accepted must be absolute and unqualified. If a person changes the price of at a new term, this becomes a counter offer. In this case, John first offered 45,000 ringgit instead of the advertised price of 15,000 ringgit. Since Motor Speed rejected his proposal, the early negotiation had already come to an end. John may argue that his later email agreeing to pay 15,000 ringgit was validly accepted. However, this argument is not convincing because the accepted can only operate on an existing offer. After a counter offer has been rejected, any later communication is normally treated as a fresh proposal that still requires a new accepted. Therefore, because Peter's Motor never accepted John's email but accepted a Jane offer of 55,000 ringgit, a valid contract was formed between Jane and the company. For this reason, Jane has a strong legal position in this case.
My name is Johanna. My metric number is S75132. For ethical reasoning, our group uses the ontological principle of fair dealing. This principle means a business must treat customers fairly, consistently, and transparently, not only focus on profit. In this case, Speedster Motor has the legal right to reject John's RM55,000 counter offer and accept Jane's higher offer of 55,000. However, from an ethical point of view, the issue is not the acceptance of Jane's offer. The real issue is the company's failure to communicate properly with John. After John sent an email agreeing to buy the car at RM50,000, Speedster Motor should have informed him clearly and quickly that the car had already been sold. By not doing so, the company allowed John to think that his proposal might still be considered. This is unfair and does not reflect fair dealing. Jane, on the other hand, acted ethically because she made her offer openly and honestly. Next, for more reasoning, the principle is good faith and the professional value are honesty and transparency. Good faith means party must act sincerely and fairly during negotiations. In this case, John acted in good faith because after this first offer was rejected, he later agreed to buy the car at the advertised price of RM50,000. Jane also acted in good faith because she openly offered RM55,000 without any fraud or wrongdoing. However, Speedster Motor did not fully act in good faith because the company failed to inform John that the car had already been sold to Jane. This also showed a lack of honesty and transparency. A professional business should clearly communicate important information to customers. Therefore, our Jane contract is valid. Speedster Motor failed to meet the standard of good faith, honesty, and transparency towards John.
Hi, my name is Zahiruddin Irfan bin Zahariman Farhan. My metric number S75760. For the conclusion, the advertisement was only an invitation to trade and not a legal offer. John's proposal of Rm45,000 constituted a counter offer which terminated the original offer. Therefore, his later email agreeing to pay Rm15,000 was considered a fresh offer and not an acceptance. Since Speedster Motor have never accepted this offer, no contract was formed with John. On the other hand, Jane offer Rm55,000 was accepted immediately by Speedster Motor, creating a valid and legally binding contract. From an ethical perspective, although Speedster Motor acted legally, it should have informed John that the vehicle had already been sold. Therefore, both legally and ethically, Jane is entitled to the Speedster XS5. Thank you.